Question: what is the difference between our personality and our essence? Personality is the shell of socially acquired values, attitudes, preferences, and behavior that stem from the influences of family, culture, religion, education, and training. By contrast, essence is your innate human being. It includes your physical traits, body chemistry, artistic and athletic talents, and psychological tendencies. You do not acquire these, you are born with them. Personality, on the other hand, is everything you learn and adopt on top of essence, around essence. Essence also houses the seed of pure being that you see in infants who have no thoughts and no ego. Infants do not force an idea of themselves onto other people, and they do not judge anything. Those habits form later as part of the psychological ego and its projections and defense mechanisms as a personality. Before that, infants simply look without forcing their looking. They are untainted vehicles through which pure being sees the world without identifying with it, without establishing itself as an identity in relation to what it sees. Question: why is this such an important distinction? The simple being of essence begins its human journey asleep, in the sense that it is unaware of itself, which causes it to get attached to the mind and body. This attachment becomes what is called identification, because it leads to the formation of identity as an ego. The awareness of pure being, in essence, attaches to the mind, and the mind uses this attachment to generate a sense of I, me, and mine, which perpetuates itself in most cases for the rest of a person's life. In the process, essence gets obscured. It may atrophy, and in some cases die even while the person is still alive. Unbeknownst to itself, the only thing missing in essence is the recognition of itself as the seed of pure being. Question: why do we need the masks of personality? Because pure being cannot manifest directly in the human dimension. Even essence, which is the closest thing to pure being, is too delicate to hold up under the heavy forces at work in humanity. We need the masks, especially of personality, as a buffer to soften the impact of life. The trouble is that pure being identifies with these masks. It presumes that it is the masks and that they are real, that the form of identity they project is me. From an early age, we learn to view other people and their masks the same way. Everyone interacts as the identity of their mask, behind which pure being is ignorant of itself as the innocence of no identity. Question: so false personality is just another name for the mask or persona we wear? There's also another kind of mask we can wear when we know we are acting. This is what the fourth way calls true personality. It is still a mask, but it acts as a representative of something more genuine. It too has a vibration, but it is more a vibration of integrity. Nevertheless, the mask of true personality can quickly shift into the mask of false personality. We can be true one second and turn false the next, and vice versa. Professional actors can imitate many of these masks. The best actors can step behind their own mask, embody the inner character they want to portray, and then project the mask of that character from the inside. The only thing that is not an act and cannot be imitated is pure being in the background void that sees all the masks. But not even actors recognize the significance of this. In most cases, their ego is simply acting out another ego. Question: can you give an example of what the fourth way calls false personality? A common instance is when we feel irritated by someone else's false personality and then lapse into judgment about them. We, as a feeling of self, perceive the falseness in another person. We identify with that perception and then react to it with judgment. All of this reinforces our ego, our own false personality. The psychological device of judgment also deflects the recognition that the ego we are rebuffing in someone else is somehow symptomatic of our own artificial sense of self. False personality is a form of acting and reacting without knowing we are acting, without knowing it is a mask. It is all a projection of the ego for the sake of appearing a certain way to protect our sense of identity. This characteristic of the ego has been the same throughout history. In our age, it does not form as a point of identity or operate any differently than in the past, although it does seem to have more extreme manifestations, as evidenced in the proliferation of psychological disorders, mental illnesses, and the need for prescription medications, all of which are now regarded as normal. When you start noticing false personality in yourself and other people, you can discern its physical as well as psychological vibration. For example, our false personality often causes false personality in other people to vibrate with the same or opposite vibration, such that they like or dislike our false personality. Much of the time, this is how people relate to each other and respond to each other. Little room is left for the intermingling of essences and a deeper recognition of pure being. Question: can you say more about how the ego develops along with personality? The physiological aspect of each person's essence includes a predominant tendency around which their ego and personality develop. The fourth way calls this tendency chief feature, because it colors the entire spectrum of the mind's outlook, as well as the reactions and behavior of the body. As your personality develops, this tendency becomes exaggerated, more extreme. If you have a chief feature of power, for example, it forms as an ego with a psychological propensity to control that can at times be destructive. If you have a chief feature of vanity, it forms as an ego with a sense of pride and doubt and self-defensiveness. If you have a chief feature of fear, it forms as an identity of timidity, anxiety, excessive caution, and even obsessive preparedness. These are just general examples of 3 features. There are more. Question: does personality form as a result of identification? Yes. Identification is the psychological progression that happens when pure being is drawn out of itself and drawn into whatever object, person, or interest it becomes aware of. In Eastern traditions, this is called attachment, meaning that the awareness of pure being attaches to what it becomes aware of. The term identification is meant to emphasize that this attachment produces a sense of identity in the mind and body. When pure being is not identified, there's a different kind of recognition. There is no sense of I. There is simply being. Question. The fourth way goes into considerable detail about transformation, particularly the transformation of negative emotions. Why do you think other teachings don't do the same thing? The idea of self-transformation is ancient, but it may be that detailed knowledge about how negative emotions form in the human psyche and how non-expression of negative emotions can be used as a lever for transformation became necessary due to the rise of industrial societies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A case can be made that burgeoning populations, large numbers of people living and working in cities, and the intense pressure put on instinctive centers to compete in the industrial and now technical world has resulted in a more complicated ego, which has to rely more on negative emotions to sustain itself. If this is true, a system of knowledge like the fourth way that explains the ego in detail became necessary. It had to be a system that could be brought to bear in daily life rather than in the isolation of a monastery or ashram or cave. It also had to incorporate long-standing truths while appealing to a Western-educated mind that was unfamiliar with the language and philosophy of Eastern traditions and no longer connected to the esoteric meaning behind the great religions. Above all, it had to be a system of knowledge that is practical for the mind, because the intellectual center is better equipped to influence the emotional center than the instinctive and moving centers are. Question. Do you see any correlation between what you just described and the state of mental health today? Yes. It is no accident that we have been seeing a steady rise in the commercialism of psychology and psychotherapy. Yet they do not have all the answers to the concern and confusion that more and more people are having about identity. This also seems to be why there is a significant upsurge of interest in spirituality. Not because people are hungering for reality, but because they want to resolve conflicts in their psyche. We see this too when meditation and yoga are used primarily to lower stress, tension, and anxiety, as opposed to being vehicles for the self-realization, the recognition of pure being. Question. Why don't you endorse psychotherapy as a tool for transformation? Psychotherapy usually tries to address each negative emotion by teaching you how to adjust your sense of me so as not to give rise to that emotion. But this only reinforces the sense of me, my problem, and my attempts to fix it in myself. The fourth way takes the approach that negative emotions are different in terms of their content and manifestation, but exactly the same in terms of what is behind them and how they act as camouflage for the I and me of ego. What traditional therapy misses is the recognition that there is something behind the ego, which is the void of pure being, that this is the source of resolution, and that transformation can never happen in or to the mind. The mind is just an arena in which negative emotions entertain and sustain the ego. Question. Negative emotions occupy a lot of our time because they're given such a great deal of credence, even by professionals. It's peculiar how humanity views negative emotions and the business of expressing them as normal, healthy, necessary, and even beneficial. Only when you break negative emotions down do you see how abnormal and corrupt they are, especially in terms of how they obscure, distort, and displace pure being. Only then do you see what it means to be asleep, and that negative emotions keep us asleep. Question: are negative emotions part of the ego or separate from the ego? Negative emotions exist by themselves, but they operate in conjunction with the ego. They serve as an extension of the ego, a promulgation of the ego, and a defense mechanism of the ego, which projects itself internally and externally through the expression of negative emotions. All these projections give the impression that the ego is more substantial and more powerful than it really is. The ego is just a manifestation of energy in the psyche that has no solid basis other than identification. When you take away identification, the energy behind the ego dissipates and loses its capacity to project images of itself, especially images of itself as negative emotions. Question: so negative emotions cannot develop without an ego? That's right. Negative emotions start as a sensation that turns into a feeling, which combusts and takes shape as I. The ego forms first and creates a channel for negativity to flow through. Negative emotions then circulate through that channel and energize the ego. They are hard to stop because they are so fast. They form and immediately combust. But we can slow things down by not expressing them through the four centers and by understanding why this is significant. It is like giving ourselves time to get to a bomb and defuse the detonator before it explodes. Once it explodes, it is too late. Question: isn't it the pain body who is negative? You can think of what Eckhart Tolle calls the pain body as the psychological apparatus where negative emotions are manufactured, indulged in, and expressed. Another name for the pain body is imaginary I. It is the sense of self you imagine yourself to be, and it has its deepest roots in negative emotions, because the energy behind negative emotions has contracted and become embedded as mechanisms of psychological defense. Imaginary I wants to bear the weight of everything that has gone wrong in the past and may possibly go wrong in the future, because that weight gives it substance and significance. In doing so, it squeezes the recognition of pure being out of the picture. And this is the key thing to grasp, that imaginary I behind negative emotions exists at the expense of pure being. This is also why not expressing negative emotions is so pivotal, because it can put the brakes on the psychological momentum of negativity long enough to free the energy that is fueling the notion of I. That freed energy can then recirculate and transmute as pure being. Question: when we do contain the energy behind negative emotions, what happens next? Withholding the expression of a negative emotion contains the energy behind it, and this in turn creates an internal pressure that exposes the feeling of I, which is the ego. As pure being transcends the feeling of I by not identifying with it, the sense of identity in the negative emotion falls apart and releases the energy behind it. This energy, which had originally belonged to pure being before it became identified with sensations and emotions, returns to its source in the void, and this transforms the void. Question: but in a strange way it feels so good to express negative emotions. Expressing negative emotions feels good because it releases volatile energy. The instinctive and the emotional centers feel relieved of a burden. It also feels good because the volatility of negativity has been used by the ego as a demonstration of its strength and as a weapon for threatening and hurting and controlling and punishing the psyche of other egos, or as a way of persuading itself that its personal needs warrant special attention or pity. What gets missed in all these instances is how negative energy swells into a psychological wave that the ego rides as negative emotions. The ego paddles out again and again and rides wave after wave back to the shore of identity. Question: you make it sound easy, but negative emotions are not so easy to control. They are not easy to control because they are the most volatile energy produced by the body and mind, and because the ego is fueled by that volatility. The ego reaches its strongest levels of intensity and rigidity through negative emotions. And the specific kind of negative emotion, and whether it is active or passive, is not important. What matters is the energy behind it, because this energy is what can be transmuted as pure conscious being. For pure being, negative emotions contain the energy, the substance of itself, before that energy formed into the ego through the process of identification. Question: many teachings talk about becoming free of suffering, but the fourth way is different in this respect. Can you talk about the difference? What we experience as pressure in our lives is due to something rubbing against the mind and body. In fourth way parlance, the pressure of life rubs against the four centers, chief feature, and the ego. The normal human reaction is to resist this rubbing because it produces a charge of negative friction that can accumulate as tension, stress, and pain. All of these are magnified with real suffering, which means large forms of friction that are harder to bear. The normal response to friction is to throw it off, get rid of it, avoid it. This seems correct from the point of view of us as a person, but it is viewed differently from the perspective of pure being, because the energy of friction can transform the recognition of pure being. Question: how exactly does the energy of friction transform pure being? Friction produces an electric spark. When you bump your knee or scratch your hand or cannot find your socks, a momentary spark appears, which you usually resist right away by getting negative about it and expressing that negativity through one or more of the four centers. The energy of the spark dissipates through your negative reaction. But the same thing can happen, and instead of bolstering your sense of I through negativity, you can use the spark of friction to heighten the recognition of pure being. In simple terms, you can use friction to be more present. The most powerful sparks of friction come from intense suffering and are the most challenging to transform. But the process of transformation is always the same because pure being is always the same. Question: can you describe the transformation that happens? There is a slight shift inside when, during moments of suffering, you realize you are seeing the suffering without being part of it. These are important moments because normally all our attention is going toward our identity and what we are suffering. Such moments present the possibility for pure being to realize itself as the seeing. Small and large suffering both contain a certain tonic that can be transformed into pure being. Question: so the fourth way regards suffering as a tonic. This is just my expression, and it does not apply to all of what we call suffering. The fourth way teaches that real suffering is necessary as a catalytic force to engender the self-realization and self-transformation of pure being. It also teaches that we create unnecessary suffering for ourselves through wrong attitudes about ourselves, about events in the world, and about suffering itself. In the main, we take everything too personally in relation to our sense of I. The force of suffering comes, and we immediately think, I am suffering, instead of perceiving that the mind and body are feeling the friction we call suffering. When pure being identifies with suffering, it becomes the body and mind which are suffering. When it does not identify, it transcends the body and mind. The force of suffering is a catalyst that makes this possible. Whereas the body recoils from the force of suffering, pure being draws on the energy of suffering as a kind of fermentation of self-recognition. Question: is acceptance of real suffering a means of transformation? When there is pain and suffering, accepting the pressure they bring is helpful, but only if it leads to more or less complete non-identification. This is because acceptance is a posture of the mind. It does not come from pure being, and it does not by itself yield transformation. Transformation happens as a result of pure being recognizing itself beyond and not being identified with the suffering, as well as not being identified with the mind's acceptance or rejection of the suffering. Transformation is always beyond. Question: how does the ego play into our suffering? The psychological superstructure of I is the linchpin of all our problems and all of our unnecessary suffering. They are based on this and rely on this. What would problems and inconveniences be without the ego as their anchor? Question: can you offer a simple description of what pure being is? It is impossible to define what pure being is, but one way to pose it to the mind is to say that pure being is the void behind who you think and feel you are as a person with a distinct identity. This background of simply being is always here, like an invisible expanse of presence that encompasses your entire person and life, as well as all creation and all lives. Pure being is not a self. It is not a tangible phenomenon, nor is it an entity such as God or some celestial spirit or being. It is simply the pure reality of being, behind the manifestations of the human body and mind, and behind the sense of I they generate. This is why some ancient teachings describe it as being invisible, yet closer than your own retina. This void of being is both who you really are as being and who you are not as a human identity. The mind and body still exist and still live, but the feeling of I entrenched in them is not the real thing. It is a psychological substitute and nothing more. The mind and body can exist as just vessels for pure being without I. To the mind, all this seems impossible on the one hand and nonsensical on the other. How can you be an empty nothing and a visible something at the same time? And how can you possibly live without an identity? And yet, there is a much larger reality encompassing what we see and experience as our life as a person. Is pure being what Ouspensky was suggesting or hinting at with the idea of divided attention? The idea of divided attention is a technique that Ouspensky devised after he heard about self-remembering from George Gurdjieff. When Ouspensky tried to observe the outside world or his internal thoughts while remembering himself, he became aware of a division between what he was observing and himself as the observer. The arrow of his attention was pointing in both directions instead of only in the direction of what was being observed. This realization revealed to him a new understanding. Divided attention can also be called double attention or double awareness because you are aware of two things simultaneously instead of just one. Without self-remembering, you don't exist. The only thing that exists is what you perceive, be it a tree or a thought. With self-remembering, you also exist. You now appear inside the same circle as what you are perceiving. There's also another dimension of self-remembering, where pure being becomes aware of both you and of the object you are looking at. Pure being is then outside the circle, seeing both your person and the object your person is looking at. Ouspensky called this real self-remembering. Divided attention was just the beginning. Question: when pure being is aware of itself, do sensations and thoughts still pose a problem? Sensations, thoughts, and feelings are never the problem. The problem is our sense of identity in them. Pure being pulls back from them, steps out of the feeling of me, and recognizes its own pure perception. To the mind, this recognition seems like a return to the source, yet the source never went away. It simply recognizes that all the energy it had been expending through identification with the mind and body had always belonged to the source. Question: why does pure being get stuck in the mind? And can it choose to be free? It gets stuck because the perception of seeing thoughts gets appropriated as a feeling of me having thoughts, which imbues the mind and body with the sense of being a person. And because of our features and center of gravity, we each buy into identity in different forms. Some of us buy into ideas, ideologies, and rules. Others buy into projects, formulas, and solutions. Others buy into health, diet, and physique. And others buy into the emotional turmoil of people, problems, and the world's dilemmas. Pure being is none of these. It encompasses all of them, and it chooses to close its hooks of identity around them or to remain free as pure being. But this freedom does not mean a free body or free mind or free life or free world. It means freedom from a sense of identity in relation to all these forms. If you pull out the thread of identity, they all lose their power of persuasion. The freedom you want is pure being, but you, the person, cannot have that. Only pure being can be free from identification with you. This is possible, but only to the extent that you are not identified. Identification keeps you bound to the mind and body and to their limited perceptions of reality. Pure being cannot return to full innocence and expansion as long as it is identified. Question: when there is no identification, what happens? When there is no identification, pure being can expand as greater dimensions, such that identity as a person is seen as a tiny dot, which eventually vanishes in the distance. Envision yourself in a jet flying above the earth. As the jet gains altitude, it doesn't take long for people, cars, buildings, cities, even countries to lose distinction and disappear. Seen from a great height, they no longer exist as separate things. The same is true of how pure being views our person and life. They disappear as singular objects. This is because when you take identity out of problems and out of negative emotions, you are left with only psychological objects and energy and pure being. Question: it helps me to step outside at night and think about the universe all around me. When you look at the night sky, try not to think about the universe. Just look and notice that you are looking. Don't let your looking get swept away by thoughts. Just be here, you noticing the universe, and the universe noticing you, noticing it. Question: what is your best advice for us right now? Keep noticing that you are aware of creation, and that you are noticing that you are aware of it, and that you are noticing the noticing. Keep following that trail all the way back as far as you can.